And when it hits the continental shelf, it drops down and will drop to a range of between 1,000 and 4,000 metres. So it's incredibly deep, and you have a lot of animals down there that are relying on like marine snow, is what it's called, to feed.
Today I'm talking to Jack O'Donovan. Jack is the Communications Officer at Fair Seas. Jack is blending the art of good communication with marine science to bring the message of ocean protection to a wide audience in an engaging and impactful way. Jack is a marine biologist by training and moved into comms and campaigns in 2018 and has since worked with many large international environmental coalitions and campaigns across Europe. So hi Jack, thank you so much for coming to the Burren Nature Sanctuary, and it's such fun having somebody actually face to face to talk to rather than on a computer screen.
Thanks so much for having me here, Mary. I'm delighted to be here, and yeah, it's great to get a trip out to the Burren Inn always.
Yes, of course. So Jack is with Fair Seas, and I met the group at the Biodiversity Conference in February, I think it was. Could you tell the listeners all about Fair Seas?
Sure. So Fair Seas is an Irish campaign to create marine protected areas. So Ireland, for anyone who isn't aware, has a maritime area 7 times the size of the island. And what Fair Seas is trying to do is encourage the government to meet their targets of creating marine protected areas covering 30% or at least 30% of our maritime area by 2030. And Fair Seas is a campaign hosted by Ireland's leading environmental NGOs and networks, and has some great funders who are on board to help us with this goal. As a part of the campaign recently, so in June 2022, we produced a report called Revitalising Our Seas. And what that report really is doing is acting as a Kickstarter for the conversation surrounding marine protected areas in Irish waters. So, like I said, our goal is to ensure that Ireland sees the creation of a network of marine protected areas covering at least 30% of our maritime area by 2030. This is actually in the Irish programme for government. So currently the government have outlined that they are going to do this. However, there's been no progress on it to date. So, for example, the government had the objective of having at least 10% of our waters protected by 2020. However, still today, in 2022, we're only at 2%. And all of those areas we currently have designated are through European law, so EU law. So they're SACs mostly. And those SACs like that have been designated through European law, and we don't have any management plans in place for them. So they're kind of lines on a map and they're there, but there's nothing really actively being done to protect them.
So can you tell me, well, tell us all, why is it so important to protect these areas, and what are they subject to at the moment that needs to be stopped?
Sure. So, okay, why is it so important? So from a whole amazing plethora of reasons, we need to protect our ocean. Our ocean being the largest store of carbon on the planet, and the place where the most carbon dioxide has been drawn into since the Industrial Revolution. It's 70% of our planet, and a lot of people don't even realize as well that it's not so much the marine animals, but the plants. Like the amount of algae that grows even on the surface of the sea, that so much so that 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from the ocean, at least 50%. So that's every second breath you take, that oxygen has come straight from the ocean. So that's how connected all of us are. No matter if you live absolutely inland in continental Europe, you are directly connected to the sea.
Wow.
Always. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. So if these areas were protected, how would that affect the plant and animal life?
Sure. So the areas like that you mentioned from our report, there's 16 areas of interest that we have identified as potential marine protected areas, and they're areas that we have decided upon based on our analysis of the best available scientific data for Irish seas, looking at 5 main groups. Those groups include seabed features, seabirds, cetaceans, which is your whales, dolphins and porpoises, elasmobranchs, which is your sharks, your skates, your rays and chimeras, and as well commercially exploited species, so species that are commercially fished for. And so, what would happen if those areas were protected? So those areas we've decided are very important for those groups of species. We looked at the diversity of species and also the density, so the species density, so how many of a species and how many different kinds of species are in an area. And we kind of overlaid that data to find real hotspots. And if you think about it, like I said, the ocean provides so many what you call ecosystem services. So benefits to human society that maybe we don't always kind of feel connected to, but they're always there for us, be it climate mitigation measures or oxygen production or food production. And so by protecting these critically important areas, those habitats can be healthy, the species within it can thrive, and that allows them to produce all of those benefits. On top of all that, there's the whole protecting biodiversity for the sake of biodiversity itself, because nature deserves its own protection regardless of giving us anything. So, you know, by protecting these areas, we can allow the recovery of a lot of species, because as we know and we've seen globally across the world, the ocean is under a lot of pressure due to rising sea temperatures, ocean acidification, but also large industrial scale fishing and some damaging practices used in those industrial scale fishing activities. And as well, into the future now, we're looking at a lot of development in our sea with offshore wind and different sorts of potential marine energies that are being created, and all the infrastructural and kind of noise pollution activities that might coincide with it. So by mapping out marine protected areas as soon as possible, it means that before we get carried away with large scale industrial developments, that at least we are sure that we are not causing more harm than good when we're installing something like, say, offshore wind, for example.
And you were talking to me earlier about how, there's lots of companies that want to come in and do offshore wind off island and sell the energy to a different country. So that doesn't make sense at all. But just being the devil's advocate, I was down in Killybegs, and you can see all the fishing, quite large fishing boats, you know, tied up there, and they can only fish their quota or whatever. So what do you say to the fisherman that is already struggling to pay his debts? Or how does the government, you know, have a transition from this industry that's clearly not working so well now?
So for the Ireland's fishing community, we actually have a series on YouTube called Real Voices, and that's a series where we've been traveling around the coast interviewing people who make their living from the sea. So that's everything from people in the fishing industry to shellfish producers and things like that. And you know what we are trying to do is bring those voices that are lesser heard in the marine, say, conservation sphere into the conversation early on, because that's as well what we're encouraging the government to do, is not just designate these areas, but designate them on the best available science and by early and very engaged stakeholder engagement processes. And so what we'd say is that by working together on the ground, you know, that is how we will have an effective network of marine protected areas. When we say a network, we want this network to be well informed like that by science, but as well, you know, we need it to factor in the communities that rely on the area. And there are countless studies from around the world that show enormous benefits of marine protected areas to local fisheries. There is no study ever to show a reduction in fisheries catch due to marine protected areas. In fact, some studies have shown the biomass of marine life within a marine protected area increased by 670%. And from that, when you have that increase, you get what's called the spillover effect. And the spillover effect basically is when you allow this area to be repopulated and reproduction, and you start to have, say, more adults that are reproducing together and creating more offspring, eventually they start to push outside the boundaries of your marine protected area, and then what they do is they contribute to the stocking of the local fish stocks or crustacean stocks or whatever it is. So they can have enormous benefits for coastal communities.
That makes such sense. And do we have bottom trawling in this area, in the Irish waters at the moment? And what exactly is bottom trawling, and are they Irish boats, or where are they coming from?
Okay, sure. So look, I'll just say that I'm not a fisheries expert. That would be my area of expertise. There's a lot of people who are. There's a lot of great Irish fisheries scientists. Yes, we do have bottom trawling in Irish waters. So bottom trawling is or bottom fishing, let's say, would be the overall term for the style of fishing, and that's fishing that basically means that the gear that is used is dragged along the seafloor. And that's often used for fisheries for scallops, for example. That would be quite a common technique for that sort of fishery. And basically what it does is, essentially, if you think about it, heavy bottom gear like that, dragging along the seabed, and if you have a habitat that is quite fragile, so things like sea pens. Sea pens are something that lives in an area where you'd also have the Dublin Bay prawn, or nephrops, as they're known.
Sea pens, are they an animal?
They're an animal that's related to the anemone.
Oh.
But they're like a long stalked animal with branches coming off it, like a little bit of a long thin Christmas tree kind of an animal. And they live in colonies in areas where you also have Dublin Bay prawns, and they're very sensitive seabed habitat. And these are kind of muddy areas that are actually also very good at sequestering carbon. And so if you imagine these delicate communities there, and if something big and heavy is dragged across them, well, the whole community can be wiped out very quickly. And as well, in other areas, say in deep sea areas, you might have cold water corals and cold water coral reefs. Like the cold water coral reef communities, especially in the Irish continental shelf and the Irish continental slope area, they can be thousands of years old, those communities. And to think that it's taken so long for them to develop, and they could be just wiped out in a single go. So that's really why marine protected areas are essential, because we have so much going on in our ocean at the moment. We really need to make sure that we've mapped it out correctly to ensure we're mitigating all the damages possible to the most sensitive areas.
Yeah, that makes such sense. And the lady that works in our local health food shop has been doing her PhD on the reefs, the cold water reefs outside in Irish waters that are comparable to some of the best reefs in the world, I believe.
Oh, absolutely. All along our continental shelf and our slope here and in the deeper water. So if you look at our report Revitalising Our Seas, so that you can find that on fairseas.ie, you'll see that we have 8 coastal areas of interest for marine protected area designation, but we also have 8 offshore areas, and a lot of those would incorporate cold water coral reefs. You know, they would. Recently we saw a decision from the EU to close 16,000 square kilometres of European waters to particular types of bottom fishing, and that's areas in the deep sea below 400 metres. And a lot of those areas would include very sensitive habitats for some coral species perhaps, but as well the area just above it where there is sediment that, if it is bottom trawled, that sediment can actually rise up and it'll settle down on these coral communities and smother them essentially, you know. So it's an unbelievably diverse area, and not just for corals but also for a lot of deep sea shark species we have there. So the elasmobranch group we talked about, in our report we studied a whole remit of elasmobranch species, and so many endangered species in fact that exist out here in the deep sea, like the Portuguese dogfish for example is an incredible species of deep water shark that we have in our waters, but mostly found again in these areas along the shelf and deeper areas where you might also find the cold water coral reefs.
So just for the listeners to picture the cold water coral reef, what have we got there? What does it look like?
Sure. Well, what I would say to your listeners is the best thing to do is to search on the Marine Institute's Sea Rover project, and they've been doing surveys in all of Irish deep sea, and all the information is freely accessible. It's kind of like a freedom of information sort of a thing. You can request this data from them and they will just essentially send you the pictures and you can see for yourselves. If you go on to fairseas.ie, we also have a few photographs as well on some of our recent articles. We've used some of them, and within our report there'll be photos. But these would be communities. So imagine most people are familiar with, say, the Great Barrier Reef or the reefs of the Red Sea in Egypt, these colourful communities full of life and fish and everything. They're not dissimilar to what you'd see there. These are large coral structures down there, like large coral structures and coral gardens where you'll have assemblages of different species of corals. And people forget the coral is an animal, you know. It's an animal, and the colour of coral comes from the algae that is in a symbiotic relationship with the animal.
Okay. Interesting.
And it's perhaps different in the deep sea. In tropical coral reefs, a coral will get about 80% of its food from this algae. And that's why coral bleaching is so damaging, because when the sea temperature remains too high for too long, or acidification rises too high and remains that level for too long, the coral actually, the animal, expels the algae from its body because the algae can no longer survive, and then you have an animal that needs, you know, it's lost 80% of its food source. And then that's why you have coral dying off, is because if that algae doesn't reassimilate onto the coral, it doesn't have enough food to survive and it'll die off eventually.
Okay.
You know, which would be different. That's a different to our deep sea, of course, because there's no light down there, you know, so it's not the same relationship.
So how far down is the Irish coral reef?
So it depends on which area you're talking about here, but say in off the west coast, you know, so directly off our shore, the water stretches out and at an average depth of about 200 meters, which seems deep, but in relative ocean terms that's quite shallow. And when it hits the continental shelf, it drops down, and it'll drop to a range of between 1,000 and 4,000 meters. So it's incredibly deep, and you have a lot of animals down there that are relying on, like, marine snow is what it's called, you know, to feed. So this is the debris of all other dead plankton and algae and everything that falls from the surface, and they will feed on that as it comes down and it settles in the bottom. But you also have predatory animals down there like sharks and different things that are living down there, who also feed in the traditional sense that we'd understand. But even in Irish waters, new species are being discovered all the time. New communities and ecosystems are being discovered. There's amazing work being done out of a lot of our universities and our research institutions, and it's great to see. I was down at the launch of the RV Tom Crean, the new Marine Institute research vessel, last week in Dingle. And it's just amazing to see this investment going in to further understand our waters and hopefully lead to allowing us to better protect it.
That's great that there's some positive actions, and I think when people can see what's actually there, they then understand, why we need to conserve it. So that seems very positive. Are there any other positive stories from this project or for the marine area in general?
Definitely. I mean, what I'd say is just to see that 8 of Ireland's leading environmental NGOs and networks have come together under this one banner to really, really focus on making sure this happens is fantastic. We've been quoted now in the Dáil twice, in the Dáil Chamber. Fair Seas has been mentioned, which is fantastic to know that we're getting into the minds of our policymakers. And they've been very receptive to all the information we had. And like we said, revitalising our seas it's quite a substantial report. If you include the indices and the appendixes and everything, you're talking a couple of 100 pages. But it is the first of its kind really for Irish waters. The government did commission a report called Expanding Ireland's Marine Protected Area Network. I think that's what it's called. So it was this expert advisory group report that the government commissioned on how should we do it. But it didn't look at any areas. It hadn't mapped out where we should protect. It just said maybe why we should do it or how we could go about it and the benefits of it. So to see that a campaign of this scale is happening and that we're having positive uptake from our policymakers is wonderful.
And you're getting 2 new members of staff, is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. So we have actually 2 of our current staff moving on. So Regina Klassen, who is a co-author of Revitalising Our Seas with the Irish Wildlife Trust, is moving on now. So there'll be a Marine Policy and Advocacy Officer position that's currently open. You can find more information on the Irish Wildlife Trust website. And as well, there'll also be a position opening up for a member of our steering committee, which was the wonderful Ellen McMahon from Sustainable Water Network. And her position will be being filled in the next few weeks or months. So I'd have a look at the Sustainable Water Network website to keep tabs on that. But even within Irish waters, there's amazing success stories already happening that are actually being incorporated into these areas. So if you've ever heard of Rockabill Island, it's a small little rock with a lighthouse on it, a tiny island off the coast of Dublin, off the coast of Skerries. And that is the most important roseate tern colony in Europe. In all of Europe, this amazing bird that is endangered, that is, under high conservation importance. And the fact that its most important colony is just off the coast of Dublin, and Birdwatch Ireland, one of our partners, have a phenomenal project out there where they are working night, noon and morning all across the breeding season with a full team of volunteers and staff to protect and to monitor these birds. And they're seeing wonderful increases in the population out there, which is fantastic. And we were very lucky in June to get to bring Minister for State Malcolm Noonan out there, as well as Darragh O'Brien. He came and launched our report for us that day. He didn't join us on the island that day, but he said he'll be back, no doubt. And we brought some members from the MPWS as well out there, just to show, our members of government, this is what nature recovery can look like. And you go out to this tiny island and you have 3,500 birds nesting on this rock, and you are in this tornado of seabirds, so much so that we have to make little protective hats with cardboard in them to stop the birds biting your head, So to see that that's happening in Irish waters, to see the wonderful effort being put in by all of the groups across the country, even outside of the remit of our partners to the project, all those areas will just exponentially be benefited again by marine protected areas, because it just branches out that little bit further.
Yeah, I know Malcolm Noonan is a great bird lover as well. And yeah, I was pecked on the head by an Arctic tern, so I know that pain. And also we've had the basking shark is now a conservation protected species. So that's something that the general public can understand. What do you think about that?
Oh, it's just fantastic news. This is the result of years of hard work by many groups in the area, including the Irish Basking Shark Group and members of government who have kind of really championed the species. And it's wonderful to see this, because the Irish basking shark for one, is the second biggest fish in the sea. It's this enormous, enormous shark that on average grows to between 5 and 7 meters, but has been recorded up to 11 meters long. I mean, 11-meter shark in Irish waters. You know, I bet you there's people you'd meet and they think that is just inconceivable. They'd never consider something like that, you know, occurring in our own waters. So to have that protected and have that as such an emblem of Irish marine biodiversity, I think is so valuable and so tangible to help people connect with what else is out there. And obviously it's not all about the big things. That's always the kind of the gateway into the understanding, is you get these marvelous charismatic species like the basking sharks or the humpback whales that luckily are now also returning in higher numbers to Irish shores and are actually spreading up the west coast now, which were typically more around the south coast, around Cork and Kerry, but have really started to spread up the west coast and are being sighted more often there now, which is fantastic. But it's great to see that protection, because it also gives an indication of maybe the ambition of government to really do more to protect what we have out there. And as well, it's wonderful because the basking shark is a fish. It's the first fish protected under the Irish Wildlife Act, which is incredible. So maybe it paves the way for the possibility to protect other fish species, including things that make up the bottom of the food chain, like smaller, incredibly important fish like sprat, for example, or sand eels, those kinds of things that feed nearly everything else. You know, seabirds, cetaceans, other fish. They're so such a keystone of the ecosystem. And to think that there could be now a legal pathway to incorporate them is just wonderful.
Well, it's lovely to hear you talking so passionately, because it makes people understand, you know, and if they know more about these other species, they will connect to them, but just the knowledge isn't out there. We were in Cornwall years ago when my kids were small, and there was a notice saying, don't swim in this bay, there's basking sharks. So we're like, okay, we're going to go to the next bay. So anyway, we went to the next bay, swimming along, and of course the basking sharks were in the next bay, and they were so close, and you didn't feel at all threatened. They were literally hanging there like submarines, you know, quite close to the shore, and we were swimming around. There they are. There are the basking sharks. You know, they were absolutely beautiful.
And that's the best thing about basking shark protection now, because they are often people's maybe first encounter. I would say basking sharks and maybe humpback whales, if you're lucky enough and have the privilege to go whale watching in the summertime, that is another species that people might come across, you know, a large charismatic species. But again, basking sharks are fantastic. And the other great thing about the protection is that it allows for the creation of a code of conduct, because obviously basking sharks are incredible, but we have to be mindful that these are wild animals and they are here to feed. So they're here to perform, you know, key biological function of theirs. And that if we disturb them too much, we'll disturb the behavior and can affect the health of the creatures overall. So it's great to see that, you know, the protection will allow for the lack of disturbance to, say, breeding grounds and habitat, but also to ensure that we can be mindful and respectful of these amazing animals in our waters.
I went whale watching in Cork last year, and it's a protected area there, and the amount of dolphins, just for a start, was incredible. And we saw minke whales in the distance, but the boat wouldn't go anywhere near them. You know, they were very good. They were just like, you know, get the binoculars and look over there, and there she is. But even to see that whale in the distance, I recommend it to everybody. It was just fabulous. Have you got a favourite species that you'd like to talk about, plant or animal?
Favorite species, that is an incredibly tricky one. Personally,
one.
I have one. Okay, I have two. If I
well,
can go
something
for two.
you're interested in at the moment. Yeah.
One that I'm really interested in is, well, there's a few. So okay, can I pick three?
Oh, please do.
Can I pick? I'll pick three that kind of range across different things. So one of them would be cat sharks. So the lesser spotted cat shark is a very small coastal shark that you see in shallow waters very easily. And I totally fell in love with this species because I'm from West Cork myself, and there's a very, very small bay outside Timoleague in West Cork, not far from Clonakilty. And it's a tiny bay, and I go swimming there a lot, and you can swim out of the little cove and you're out onto quite a large sandbank. And every time I go there, I'm swimming and I'm looking down, and there's just these cat sharks sitting on the bottom, and they're beautiful, kind of a beige with all these leopard prints all over their bodies. You know, they're quite long and slender, and they just sit there, you know, and you can swim along, and I often go out and I count how many different ones you'd see in an area, you know, and they'd sit there, and sometimes, you know, if you're there, you dive down a little bit, and they'll just sit there looking at you, you know, and they're these incredible, to think a shark, you know, such a beautiful creature, and they're just living out there, and they're so easy to see, you know. It's same as, it'll be a similar class, people will be more familiar with the word dogfish, but the lesser spotted cat shark would be very similar, you know,
type of
fish. And it's just wonderful to see them so close, and they're so easy to see. Such a, again, kind of charismatic species, I suppose. And then the other two species I guess I'd love to mention are kelp is one of them, obviously. Kelp being an algae, you know, Laminaria digitata being one of the most large species that these form huge underwater forests across our shores. And like, I'm a biologist myself, but until I was like 16, I'd say, I was terrified of seaweed. If I touched it when I was swimming, I was like freaked out. It was dark down there. I didn't want to know, it was just, it was totally freaky. You never know what's going to come out of it. But until, you understand, like until you know what it is and what it can support and what's in there, then all of a sudden the fear disappears and you're just absolutely amazed. So I scuba dive myself, and one of my favorite things to do is just go along the edges of a kelp forest, stick your head in between the fronds or in between the stipe, which is like the trunk. Say if you have a tree, you have the trunk and you have the branches, and the kelp you have what's called a stipe, which is the long part that grows up, and then out of that the fronds, which are like the leaves, the fingers kind of that grow out of it. And they just support an amazing array of diversity. You'll go in there and you'll see shark eggs that have been attached to it, or skate or ray eggs that have been attached to it. You'll see sponges and other kind of algae, maybe even growing up the sides. And then inside, among the fronds, in the real forest, in the dense part, you'll see a lot of juvenile fish from species ranging from cod to all sorts of things like gobies and blennies and all these amazing creatures that live there. But they're important for sequestering carbon because they're so fast growing and they can store carbon. But they're so important as well just for creating that habitat for nurseries.
For cover for these young animals.
Exactly. Which is they're truly phenomenal. And I guess the other species I'd love to mention is merrill. So merrill is a species of calcareous algae. So this is an algae that forms a hard calcium skeleton, and it's a species that is it wouldn't be in the popular realm of things, but if you go to Trá an Dólín in Gararua in Connemara, which is Coral Strand, you can find it on Google Maps, up in Carraroe in County Galway. This is a beach where there are live merrill beds out in the water. But then, obviously, as the merrill grows and it dies, the merrill gets washed up, and you walk in. This just looks like a regular beach. It's a small little cove with boulders and different stuff and rocks sticking out, and you can see the sand from the car park until you walk down onto the beach and you realize there's not a grain of sand on the beach. The entire beach is merrill. So it's these little, looks like coral from a coral reef. It looks like these kind of knobbly structures, tiny small, like you're talking 1 or 2 centimeters tall, because it's all broken up, and among that then just full of shells. But it also means that the water in Trá an Dólín there is unbelievably clear. Like, it's crystal clear. First place I ever scuba dived when I was in university. I joined the local club in NUIG, and I remember going out there on the 22nd of December. It was freezing cold in a wetsuit that didn't fit, but diving out of water and just being blown away by how clear it is. So that's another one. And merrill would be a species that would be very highly considered in the seabed features in our report, because it's so delicate. It's such a fragile ecosystem, but again, it forms these kind of a biogenic habitat where it's growing, but between it other things are living out their lives and creating their lives in there as well.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? Like the wilderness area on our farm is just a cover for so many species. And I will put up the picture of the protected areas that Fair Seas are trying to work on our Instagram. You're so passionate, Jack, about the sea and conservation. So just before we end, can you tell us where this ignited from in your life?
I guess it's hard to say. I mean, I'm very lucky that I grew up in West Cork, and we grew up surfing and swimming, and I was born on the 7th of January, so the middle of winter, but every year when I was a child I had my birthday on the beach. Oh. Yeah. And we used to go down with raincoats and a barbecue.
My goodness.
And there'd be games of soccer, football, and there'd be barbecue and cake on the beach in the rain and the wind. Often, you'd have to resort back to going home eventually, when it got too bad. But I know I've just been obsessed with the beach and the sea for a long time. But again, people always think that, especially people who are aspiring to move into something, think you have to be extremely passionate about something. That's not the case. Like, I went to university in NUIG in Galway, and when I got there, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So even up until third year, I was still studying pharmacology, toxicology, like things that are a completely different realm from what I'm doing now. But I ended up specialising then in marine botany and in zoology. Mm-hmm. And I guess once I got into that, and I was very lucky that when I was in college, during college, just kind of worked all throughout the year to the detriment maybe of some of my grades, but managed to save up a bit of money that over the summer I could go away, and I volunteered in Greece on a sea turtle research project.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
Which is brilliant, and it's great, especially for students. It's called Archelon, and it's extremely accessible. Like, there's a lot of these volunteer conservation groups now that are really just charging people money. They're really ripping people off, but Archelon is the kind of, I suppose, official Greek sea turtle research institute, I suppose you'd say, and it's really accessible. It's really cheap. Hardly costs you any money to go out there, and you sleep in a tent, on the beach, and you spend your days researching and protecting sea turtle nests. And so that really was a time to be in nature, like on your 10 hours a day on these beaches, surveying and telling people about it. And then when I finished university, I got a position as a research assistant with a group they're now called, I think, the Pacific Whale Foundation, is that what they're called? A place called Whale Point anyway in British Columbia. And I got to spend a couple of months out there on an uninhabited island researching humpback whales and killer whales.
Sounds very exotic.
Yeah, it was absolutely incredible. And like that, just spent, I suppose, when I should have been studying, spent more time working in pubs, trying to save up the money because I knew this was something that was going to happen afterwards. But luckily, the grades were fine in the end, and managed to get out there and spent that time. And just to be in a place, it was the first time in the world where I was in a place where humans had no claim. Like, you'd go for a walk in the forest and there'd be paths through the forest, but they're not human paths. Like, you walk in the woods here and there's all the worn trails. All the places you walk, and I remember realizing this, almost coming face to face with a black bear one time, where I was walking and I thought I was kind of lost, and we were with a group and we got lost and we thought we were following the trail that the group had made, until all of a sudden we come like nearly face to face with this black bear.
Really?
And realize this is the black bear's trail and this is the wolf's trail, because there's no people here, the only people.
And did you see him straight on, or was he
was just the far side of a bush. Like, we came and we were walking, we split up from the group, we lost them. And then we were calling. We said, "Hey, we're here." We ran up to this bush, and we just got to the other side of a kind of like, like a big gorse bush with a bit of bramble or something like that. And we just got up to the other side. We're like, "Hey," because we heard them walking, and all we heard was, and you're warned about the bears, and you have bear spray and all this.
We lost a little bit of audio there, but just to fill you in, Jack made a lot of noise, clapped his hands, and jumped around, and the black bear ran away.
Have you any book that you'd like to recommend to the listeners?
So let's see. I actually recently only started listening to audiobooks because I'm a terrible reader. I think maybe I don't have the patience, or just for sitting still for that long. I've never been good at it. But one book that I think actually is really important, especially for Irish people, and people living in Ireland, would be the book called 32 Words for Field by Manchan Magan. And important not in the context of, if you know nothing about the Irish language or Irish or have any interest in it, it doesn't really matter, but more so to show that we had, and hopefully we'll have again, and still have in some parts, such a connection to the land and the landscape. And I know Manchan has a new book out actually called, what's it called now? He's some new book out now anyway, something like Speak for the, I don't know, listen to the, I don't know. Anyway,
I
a new book.
Yeah.
And the book basically,
I'll get the name. I'll put them in the show notes.
Oh, great! Yeah, and I haven't read the new one yet now, but it talks about the fact that language, the Irish language, was used really so much more intimately, maybe, to help us describe and tell stories of our landscape. And the fact that 32 words for field, it means that fields is not just a field. The word, you don't just have a word for field. You have, you do in modern Irish now. People use different words, but the word would be far more descriptive, and it would depict the exact purpose of the field. And actually, if I'm going to be 100% honest, my favourite book I've ever read was a book that a neighbour of mine in West Cork wrote. It's like the memoir of one of these owl boys who lived on the road. His name was Dan Crowley, and he wrote a book called My Time in My Place. And he lived his whole life on this one road. He saw the road turn from a dirt track to a tarmac road. He saw the introduction of electricity to the area, the introduction of the electric fence to the area. Like, he saw, Dan probably died 10 or 15 years ago now, and he was 80 something when he died. So, he'd seen a lot of changes in his time. But the interesting thing is, like, between, say, where our house was, our family home, and Dan's farm, there was 2 big fields. But when I read his book, there was 40 fields between those 2 houses, when he was first on the farm. And he said, and he named them, and he said each of the fields had its own name. And they were because this something grew particular in that field, and you'd always cut something different from that field in this field, or that's where the calves were put early in the year, in this particular one. And now it's just one big field.
Bulldoze the walls away, or the hedges.
Exactly. There's no hedges or no ditches there. Luckily they did keep a couple of lovely big trees that are in the field, but maybe 3 trees out of hectares of land. And again, look, that's no detriment to the farmers, and even Dan, who would have known a lot about it. the reason they started bulldozing ditches was because in the 50s the government brought in schemes for people for agricultural improvement, as they called it, schemes, and those you would get grants to clear your ditches and to drain the bogs. And in the area where I live, like, you know, there's no bog whatsoever anywhere, but in his book he talked about how all the low part that borders the river, he said that was all bog, and they drained it all and they seeded it for grass and stuff like that. You know, it's been like that now for 70 years or something. But so yeah, I think Manchan Magan's books are great, just to give us that connection to how deeply, you know, intertwined our lives and even our language was with the world around us, is a great kickstarter into opening our eyes more so to the world around us.
Yeah, and I think Irish people have that in them still, but they don't quite understand it because they have been separated slightly from the land. But there is a kind of a longing to get that connection back. So thank you so much, Jack. It was a really, really inspiring interview. Thank you so much for coming.
Great, thanks so much for having me. And like I say, if anyone wants to find any more information, everything's on fairseas.ie. And if you have any questions, just please follow us on social media or sign up to our monthly newsletter. That's the best way to get involved at the moment, and any of the key kind of campaign asks and objectives will be shared through that portal first.
Oh, that's wonderful, and I'll put all that information in the show notes. Thanks a million.
News for Burren Nature Sanctuary. This week's episode is 1 week late in respect of Eilish Bermingham, Roy's mother, whose funeral was last Sunday.